Some people mistake silence for weakness. Tonight, they were about to learn the difference. The words were never spoken inside the restaurant, yet they seemed to linger beneath the soft piano music drifting through the crystal chandeliers of the Hawthorne Room, one of downtown Chicago's most exclusive dining destinations. Every polished glass reflected wealth. Every tailored suit whispered influence. Every quiet conversation carried the confidence of people accustomed to getting exactly what they wanted. Naomi Carter moved carefully between white linen tables with the practiced balance of someone who had carried heavy trays for years. At 24, she knew how to disappear when customers wanted privacy and how to appear the instant someone lifted a finger. It was a skill she had mastered after thousands of shifts, double weekends, aching feet, and smiles offered even when they were never returned. She wasn't working toward luxury. She was working toward tomorrow. Every paycheck helped cover rent, helped keep groceries in the apartment she shared with her younger brother Marcus, and helped pay the tuition bills he never stopped apologizing for. Naomi always gave him the same answer. Keep studying. I'll handle the rest. Their late mother had repeated one lesson more often than any other. Character costs something. If it doesn't, it probably isn't character. Naomi carried those words with her more faithfully than any lucky charm. Across the dining room, an elderly Asian woman entered alone. She wore a simple navy cardigan over a modest cream blouse, comfortable shoes instead of expensive heels, and carried an old leather handbag that looked decades older than the luxury cars parked outside. Nothing about her suggested importance. Most guests barely noticed her. The hostess smiled politely before seating her near the center of the room. The woman thanked her with a gentle nod and quietly unfolded her napkin, studying the menu with calm eyes that seemed completely untouched by the restless energy surrounding her. A few minutes later, another guest strode through the entrance as though the building belonged to him. Trevor Blake never raised his voice when he wanted attention. He simply expected it. His designer watch caught the warm lighting as he walked past waiting customers without acknowledging anyone standing in line. Staff members exchanged nervous glances before hurrying to prepare his favorite table. Trevor enjoyed that reaction. It reminded him that money often arrived before respect. Naomi noticed him only long enough to refill a nearby water glass before returning to her section. She had learned long ago that confidence and kindness rarely arrived wearing the same expression. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary until a server carrying hot tea brushed past the elderly woman. Startled, she shifted her chair slightly, and her handbag slipped from her lap onto the floor. The cup rattled against its saucer, sending a few drops of tea onto Trevor's expensive jacket as he walked behind her table. The stain was barely noticeable. His reaction was impossible to ignore. Conversation slowed. Silverware paused halfway to waiting plates. Trevor stared at the older woman with visible disbelief, as though an inconvenience had become a personal insult. The woman immediately reached for a napkin, apologizing softly while trying to wipe away the tiny drops. Her hands trembled slightly. Instead of accepting the apology, Trevor stepped closer, speaking with the icy confidence of someone certain nobody would challenge him. Nearby diners lowered their eyes. A manager hesitated several feet away, calculating the cost of intervening. The elderly woman remained seated, her shoulders small beneath the restaurant lights, surrounded by dozens of people and somehow completely alone. Naomi watched from across the room. She glanced at the manager, then back at the frightened woman. She quietly placed her serving tray onto an empty table. Before fear could convince her to stay where she was, she took one steady breath and began walking toward them. Naomi stopped an arm's length away from the table, her voice calm enough to soften the tension without pretending it did not exist. "Sir, it was an accident. Please allow me to take care of your jacket." Trevor turned slowly, almost amused that someone wearing a black apron had interrupted him. His eyes settled on Naomi's name tag before returning to her face. "Did I ask for your opinion?" he replied. His tone was quiet, but the silence that followed carried farther than a shout. Several guests suddenly found their plates far more interesting than the unfolding scene. Others watched discreetly over raised wine glasses, unwilling to become part of someone else's problem. Naomi kept her posture steady. She had seen anger before. She had seen people confuse expensive clothing with unquestionable authority. What she had not learned was how to ignore someone who needed help standing alone. "No, sir. she answered respectfully. But she apologized immediately, and I believe everyone deserves a little grace. Trevor gave a humorless laugh that drew uncomfortable smiles from two business associates seated nearby. Grace does not pay for custom tailoring. He brushed a nearly invisible drop from his sleeve as though the fabric had been permanently ruined. The elderly woman lowered her eyes again. I truly am sorry, she said softly. Please let me pay for the cleaning. Her voice carried the gentle rhythm of someone who had spent a lifetime choosing peace over conflict. Trevor shook his head. You could not afford to replace the buttons. Naomi noticed the woman's fingers tighten around the worn leather handbag resting in her lap. It was not fear alone she recognized. It was dignity struggling not to disappear. The restaurant manager, Eric Sullivan, finally approached with careful steps and a practiced smile. Years in fine dining had taught him that difficult customers often spent the most money. Mr. Blake, he began diplomatically. Perhaps we can provide complimentary cleaning services while everyone enjoys dinner. Trevor barely looked at him. I am not interested in complimentary anything. I want accountability. Eric glanced briefly toward Naomi, silently urging her to step back. She understood the message immediately. Let management handle it. Protect the restaurant. Preserve the evening. It was the safest choice. It was also the easiest. Naomi remembered another evening years earlier, standing beside a hospital bed as her mother struggled to catch each breath. Her mother had squeezed her hand with surprising strength and whispered words Naomi never forgot. When someone is frightened, they remember the face that stood beside them, not the crowd that looked away. The memory passed through her mind in an instant, steadying her heartbeat. She looked toward the elderly woman, whose quiet composure somehow seemed stronger than everyone else's silence combined. Sir, Naomi said gently, if anyone should apologize further, it can be me. I will personally arrange whatever the restaurant can reasonably do. But I cannot stand here while someone is spoken to without kindness. Eric inhaled sharply. Trevor's expression hardened, not with outrage, but with disbelief. No one challenged him in places like this. Certainly not a waitress working the dinner shift. Around the dining room, conversations faded almost completely. Even the pianist slowed his hands for a brief moment before continuing the melody. The elderly woman finally lifted her eyes toward Naomi. There was gratitude there, certainly, but something else as well. It was the calm, careful look of someone quietly measuring character rather than courage, and Naomi, without realizing it, had just given an answer to a question nobody else in the room knew was being asked. The room no longer sounded like a luxury restaurant. It sounded like people pretending not to hear their own conscience. Crystal glasses caught the warm light. Silverware rested untouched beside expensive meals that suddenly no one seemed eager to finish. Every pair of eyes drifted toward the small circle surrounding Naomi, Trevor, and the elderly woman before quickly looking away again, hoping someone else would decide how the evening should end. Trevor folded the linen napkin with deliberate care, almost smiling as though patience itself proved he controlled the room. You have a remarkable amount of confidence for someone wearing an apron, he said. Do you understand how quickly that uniform can disappear? Naomi met his gaze without raising her voice. I understand that jobs can be replaced. Character cannot. The words landed gently, but they lingered in the silence far longer than anyone expected. Eric Sullivan immediately stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Naomi could hear. Please, he whispered, forcing a polite smile for nearby guests. Let me handle this before it gets worse. Naomi respected Eric. He had given her extra shifts when Marcus needed school supplies. He had rearranged schedules when she stayed overnight at the hospital with her mother years earlier. She knew he was trying to protect the restaurant, not just himself. Still, she quietly answered, I cannot pretend this is normal. Eric closed his eyes for the briefest moment before turning back toward Trevor. Mr. Blake, perhaps we could continue this discussion in my office. Trevor laughed softly. No, I think everyone should hear it. If your employees are going to lecture paying customers, perhaps they should learn what consequences look like. A nervous murmur spread through the dining room. A young couple celebrating an anniversary exchanged uneasy glances. An older gentleman folded his newspaper and watched with growing concern. Even the bartender stopped polishing glasses. Across the table, the elderly woman remained remarkably composed. She looked at Naomi with calm eyes that revealed neither panic nor embarrassment. Instead, There was quiet curiosity, almost as though she had seen moments like this many times before. She slowly reached for her teacup and took another careful sip despite the uncomfortable attention surrounding her. Naomi noticed the tiny detail and wondered how someone facing public humiliation could still move with such peaceful confidence. Trevor noticed it as well, although he interpreted it differently. "You seem awfully calm," he remarked. "Most people would have left by now." The woman offered a gentle smile. "Running away rarely teaches anyone the right lesson." Trevor dismissed the answer with a wave of his hand. Interesting philosophy. Then he turned toward Eric again. "I expect her removed from the floor before I finish dessert." His eyes shifted back to Naomi. "Otherwise, I will make a few phone calls tomorrow morning, and this place will regret tonight." Eric's shoulders stiffened. He knew Trevor's name carried influence with investors, developers, and several members of the restaurant's ownership group. One complaint from the wrong person could become weeks of meetings, apologies, and financial pressure. Naomi understood the same reality the moment she saw the concern in Eric's face. She knew exactly what standing here might cost. Yet something inside refused to measure kindness against convenience. The elderly woman carefully placed her cup onto the saucer and finally spoke again, her voice warm enough to quiet even the tension hanging in the air. "Young lady," she said to Naomi, "thank you. Very few people choose courage when silence is easier." Naomi smiled gently. "My mother taught me that respect should never depend on someone's clothes, money, or age." The woman nodded slowly, as though committing every word to memory. Outside the restaurant's towering windows, black luxury vehicles quietly rolled to the curb one after another. None of the guests noticed them yet. Inside, the evening still appeared to belong to Trevor Blake. In reality, the balance of power had already begun to change, although only one person in the room seemed to recognize it. The elderly woman folded her hands neatly on the table as if the entire restaurant had faded into the background. Her composure unsettled Trevor far more than any argument could have. He expected pleading. He expected embarrassment. Instead, he found quiet patience, the kind that could not be purchased or intimidated. Eric Sullivan forced another courteous smile, though the strain was beginning to show around his eyes. "Mr. Blake, I assure you we value every guest. Let us replace your jacket at the restaurant's expense and allow everyone to enjoy the evening." Trevor slowly shook his head. "You still do not understand. This stopped being about a jacket several minutes ago." He looked directly at Naomi. "Your employee has questioned me in front of an entire dining room. That has consequences." Naomi answered with the same calm tone she had maintained from the beginning. "I did not question your success, sir. I only asked that an older woman be treated with respect." Trevor smiled without warmth. "Respect is earned." The elderly woman quietly looked toward him. "Sometimes," she replied gently, "respect is revealed by how we treat people who can offer us nothing in return." Several nearby guests exchanged thoughtful glances. One businessman slowly lowered his phone after pretending to check messages. A woman celebrating her birthday nodded almost imperceptibly before returning her attention to the conversation. The atmosphere had changed. It was no longer one powerful customer confronting a waitress. It had become something much larger. Everyone was silently deciding which kind of person they wanted to be. Trevor noticed the shifting expressions around him and immediately tried to regain control. "Eric," he said firmly, "either she apologizes to me right now, or she leaves this dining room before I finish my meal." Eric hesitated. His responsibility was to protect the restaurant, his employees, and every guest sitting under the elegant chandeliers. Those duties suddenly pointed in different directions. "Naomi," he said quietly, perhaps we should step into my office for a moment." Naomi understood exactly what he was asking. If she walked away now, the situation would probably disappear. She might keep her job. The restaurant would avoid unwanted attention. Everyone could return to their expensive dinners as though nothing important had happened. She looked toward the elderly woman, whose gentle smile had not changed once. Something about that smile reminded Naomi of her mother waiting outside her elementary school every rainy afternoon, never complaining, never leaving early, always teaching by quiet example instead of loud speeches. Naomi drew a slow breath. "Mr. Sullivan," she said respectfully, "if standing beside someone who needed kindness costs me this job, then I will accept that. but I cannot apologize for showing basic decency. Eric lowered his eyes for a brief moment. He knew she believed every word she had spoken. Trevor gave a dismissive chuckle. You are making a very expensive mistake. Maybe, Naomi answered. But some mistakes are easier to live with than regrets. For the first time that evening, the elderly woman allowed herself a slightly broader smile. She carefully reached into her well-worn handbag, not hurriedly, not dramatically, simply as though searching for something ordinary. She removed a neatly folded handkerchief embroidered with delicate blue flowers and gently placed it beside her teacup before looking at Naomi once more. Young lady, she said softly, the world changes because of people who refuse to calculate the price of doing what is right. Naomi felt an unexpected warmth behind those words, almost as though they carried years of wisdom rather than simple gratitude. Outside, the line of black luxury vehicles had quietly grown longer along the curb. Well-dressed men in dark suits stepped onto the sidewalk with disciplined precision, speaking into discreet earpieces before taking measured positions near the entrance. Inside, the hostess glanced through the glass doors, her expression shifting from routine professionalism to unmistakable surprise. Guests closest to the windows slowly turned their heads, sensing that someone important had just arrived. Trevor noticed the movement and smiled confidently, convinced the evening was finally about to return to his advantage. He had no idea that the next person to walk through those doors would change every assumption he had made since the moment the elderly woman entered the restaurant alone. The front doors opened without fanfare, yet the atmosphere shifted as surely as if the temperature inside the restaurant had changed. The hostess straightened instinctively. Valets outside stepped aside with unusual precision. Half a dozen men dressed in dark tailored suits entered one after another, not hurried, not intimidating, simply disciplined. Their eyes moved quietly across the dining room before settling on the elderly woman. None of them approached immediately. Instead, they waited near the entrance with remarkable patience, as though an unspoken rule mattered more than speed. Trevor noticed them and leaned back with renewed confidence. Finally, he said with a satisfied smile, looks like someone important has arrived. He glanced toward Eric Sullivan. Perhaps now we can end this unnecessary distraction. Eric was no longer certain what was happening. He followed the gaze of the newcomers and realized every one of them was looking toward the same table, toward the elderly woman. A quiet uneasiness settled over him. The woman herself remained perfectly relaxed. She lifted her teacup once more, taking another slow sip as though she had not noticed the arrival at all. Naomi watched the scene unfold with growing curiosity. Something about the men's posture caught her attention. It was not fear. It was respect, the kind that could not be demanded, the kind that had been earned over many years. One of the suited men stepped forward just enough to catch the woman's attention without interrupting her conversation. He offered a slight bow of his head. Ma'am, he said softly, he is on his way. The elderly woman acknowledged him with nothing more than a gentle nod before turning back to Naomi. I believe, she said with a warm smile, our conversation will have to pause for a few moments. Naomi smiled politely, still unable to understand why everyone suddenly seemed so alert. Trevor folded his arms. Is this some kind of performance? He asked. Because I am not impressed. No one answered him. The silence that followed felt strangely different from the uncomfortable silence earlier that evening. Before, people had remained quiet because they were afraid to speak. Now they remained quiet because they were waiting. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, another black vehicle pulled smoothly to the curb. It was elegant without being flashy, expensive without trying to announce its value. A tall man stepped out wearing a charcoal suit with no visible logos, no extravagant jewelry, and no unnecessary display of wealth. He walked with measured confidence, acknowledging the staff outside with a simple nod before entering the restaurant. The moment he crossed the entrance, every suited man standing nearby straightened almost simultaneously. The dining room grew so still that the soft piano melody seemed louder than before. Several guests recognized the newcomer immediately. Whispered conversations spread from one table to another. Is that Daniel Kong? Someone murmured. The logistics billionaire? Another quietly replied. Eric felt his heartbeat quicken. Even he knew the name. Daniel Kong rarely appeared in public, yet his companies employed thousands across the country. His reputation was built on discipline, discretion, and impossible business negotiations. Trevor's confident smile widened. He had attended industry conferences where Daniel Kong had spoken, although they had never met personally. Trevor instinctively adjusted his jacket, convinced this unexpected arrival might become an opportunity rather than an interruption. Daniel, however, never looked in Trevor's direction. His attention remained fixed on one person only. He crossed the marble floor with calm, deliberate steps until he reached the elderly woman's table. Naomi expected him to introduce himself. Eric expected a formal greeting. Trevor expected recognition. Instead, Daniel's expression softened completely. Without hesitation, he stopped beside the table, bowed his head deeply, and said with unmistakable affection, "Mother, I am sorry I kept you waiting." Every sound inside the Hawthorne room disappeared. Forks remained suspended above untouched dinners. Conversations ended mid-sentence. Trevor's confident expression slowly faded as he realized the quiet woman he had dismissed all evening was not simply an elderly guest enjoying dinner alone. She was the one person in the room whom Daniel Kong valued above everyone else. Daniel Kong remained standing beside the table, his attention fixed entirely on the elderly woman. The warmth in his expression was impossible to mistake. It was not the practiced smile of a billionaire greeting investors or cameras. It was the quiet affection of a son relieved to see his mother safe. Mrs. Eun-hee Kong smiled gently and reached for his hand. "You worried too much," she said. "I only wanted a peaceful dinner." Daniel's eyes softened before they briefly swept across the room, taking in every face without appearing hurried. Years of leadership had taught him to observe before speaking. He noticed the untouched tea, the anxious expression on Eric Sullivan's face, Naomi still standing respectfully beside the table, and finally Trevor Blake, whose confidence had begun to give way to uncertainty. Daniel turned back to his mother. "Did anyone make your evening less peaceful?" he asked quietly. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward Naomi with unmistakable gratitude. "This young woman made sure I was not alone when kindness became unfashionable." Daniel followed her gaze. Naomi instinctively lowered her eyes, uncomfortable with becoming the center of attention. She had not stepped forward hoping to impress anyone. She had simply acted before fear had the chance to stop her. Daniel offered her a respectful nod. "Thank you for standing beside my mother." Naomi answered honestly, "Sir, I only did what I hoped someone would do for my own family." Those words lingered in the silence. Daniel did not respond immediately. He simply studied her expression, searching for signs of exaggeration or expectation. He found neither. There was no calculation in her voice, no hidden request, no anticipation of reward. Only sincerity. Mrs. Kong smiled again. "I asked her why she risked her job," she said softly. "She told me respect should never depend on money, age, or clothing." Daniel looked back at Naomi, and for the first time that evening, a faint smile appeared across his face. "My mother has spent her entire life teaching that lesson," he said. Tonight, she found someone who already believed it. Trevor cleared his throat, eager to regain control before the moment slipped further away. He stepped forward with a polished smile that appeared only after recognizing Daniel. "Mr. Kong, I believe there has been a misunderstanding." Daniel acknowledged him with a polite glance, but did not interrupt. Trevor continued confidently. "This was simply an unfortunate accident that became unnecessarily emotional. I am certain we can move forward like professionals." Daniel listened without changing expression. "Perhaps," he replied calmly. "The security cameras can help us understand exactly what happened." Trevor's smile faltered for the first time. Eric immediately understood the request. The Hawthorne room maintained high-definition cameras covering every dining area for guest safety. Nothing that had happened near the table would be missing. Daniel did not raise his voice or issue demands. "Mr. Sullivan," he said courteously, "would you be willing to review the recording with everyone present?" Eric nodded almost immediately. "Of course, sir." Around the dining room, guests exchanged quiet looks. Some had witnessed only pieces of the confrontation. Others had avoided watching altogether. The cameras had done neither. They had recorded every word, every gesture, every opportunity for kindness, and every decision to remain silent. Mrs. Kong gently placed her hand over Daniel's wrist. "My son," she said with her familiar calm, "I am not interested in embarrassing anyone." Daniel nodded respectfully. "Neither am I, mother." His eyes moved once more across the room before returning to Trevor. But truth deserves the same respect that kindness does. Trevor suddenly found the restaurant feeling much smaller than before. The audience he believed would support him had become a room full of witnesses waiting for facts instead of opinions. Naomi remained exactly where she had been from the beginning of the evening, beside an older woman who had entered the restaurant looking like an ordinary guest. Only now did she fully understand why that quiet confidence had never disappeared. Real authority had never needed to announce itself. It had simply waited for character to reveal everyone else. Eric Sullivan returned a few minutes later carrying a tablet connected to the restaurant's security system. No one spoke while he walked across the dining room. Even the piano had fallen silent, leaving only the quiet hum of the air conditioning and the faint clink of ice melting inside forgotten glasses. Eric stopped beside Daniel Kong and held the screen where everyone at the nearby tables could see it. "The recording includes both video and audio," he said carefully. "It begins several minutes before the incident." Daniel gave a simple nod. "Please play it from the beginning." The footage unfolded exactly as the evening had happened. Guests watched Trevor walk confidently through the dining room. They watched the elderly woman politely thank the hostess before taking her seat alone. They watched the accidental spill that amounted to only a few drops of tea. Then they watched something far more revealing. Trevor's dismissive tone, the elderly woman's immediate apology, Naomi quietly stepping forward instead of looking away. Every expression that memory had softened now appeared with perfect clarity. Nobody could argue with the recording. Nobody needed to explain what had happened. The truth spoke for itself. A quiet murmur spread through the restaurant. Several guests lowered their eyes, uncomfortable that they had witnessed everything earlier, yet chosen silence over action. One businessman slowly stood and addressed Mrs. Kong. "Ma'am," he said sincerely, "I should have said something myself. I am sorry that I did not." Another guest nodded in agreement. "So should I." Mrs. Kong responded with the same gentle grace she had shown all evening. "We all receive opportunities to become a little braver," she said. "The important thing is recognizing them when they arrive again." Daniel looked toward Eric. "Thank you for preserving the recording." Eric released a long breath he had been holding for what felt like an hour. "I am only sorry I did not intervene sooner." Daniel answered without judgment. Leadership becomes difficult when fear enters the room. What matters is what we learn afterward. Trevor remained motionless. The confidence that had filled his voice earlier had disappeared beneath the weight of undeniable evidence. He attempted one final explanation. "Mr. Kong, I admit my words could have been better, but surely this does not need to become something larger than it already is." Daniel regarded him calmly. It became larger the moment dignity was treated as optional. Trevor swallowed quietly. "I never intended to offend your mother." Mrs. Kong answered before Daniel could speak. "You did not know who I was." Trevor nodded quickly. "Exactly." She smiled sadly. "That is precisely the point." Her words settled over the room with remarkable force despite their softness. If respect only exists after someone discovers a person's influence, then it was never respect at all. It was convenience. No one disagreed. Daniel turned toward Naomi once more. "When you stepped forward," he asked, "did you recognize my mother?" Naomi shook her head immediately. "No, sir. I believed she was simply an older woman having dinner alone." "Then why continue after you realized your job might be at risk?" Naomi thought for only a moment. "Because if I walked away, I would have remembered it for the rest of my life. Losing a job can be painful. Losing the ability to respect yourself lasts much longer." Daniel remained silent for several seconds. Around him stood executives, attorneys, and trusted advisors accustomed to hearing polished answers inside boardrooms worth billions of dollars. Yet none of them carried the quiet conviction they had just heard from a waitress earning an hourly wage. Mrs. Kong reached across the table and gently took Naomi's hand. "Character," she whispered with unmistakable pride, "always introduces itself before a person's name ever does." In that moment, every title inside the Hawthorne room seemed smaller than the simple courage of the young woman who had chosen kindness before she knew who was watching. The weight of the evening had changed completely. Earlier, people had measured one another by tailored suits, private reservations, and familiar names. Now the room seemed to measure something entirely different. Daniel Kong looked toward Trevor with neither anger nor satisfaction. His expression remained composed, almost reflective. Mr. Blake, he said calmly, my companies have spent decades building partnerships. We invest in judgment before talent because talent without judgment eventually becomes expensive. Trevor lowered his eyes. For the first time that evening, he appeared to understand that the greatest loss was not public embarrassment, but the reputation that followed it. I was wrong, he admitted quietly. Mrs. Kong, Miss Carter, I should have treated both of you with greater respect. Mrs. Kong acknowledged the apology with a gentle nod. An apology matters most when it changes tomorrow, not only today. Daniel did not add another word. He simply accepted his mother's answer. There would be no dramatic punishment, no public humiliation, and no celebration of another person's mistake. That was not the lesson she had spent a lifetime teaching him. Eric Sullivan stepped forward, visibly relieved that the evening had begun moving toward peace. Mrs. Kong, Mr. Kong, I sincerely apologize for how slowly I responded. Our staff should always feel supported when protecting the dignity of every guest. Daniel smiled politely. Then begin tomorrow by making certain they know that. Eric nodded without hesitation. We will. Around the dining room, conversations slowly returned, but they sounded different now. Strangers exchanged thoughtful smiles. A young server standing near the kitchen quietly wiped tears from her eyes before returning to work. An older couple reached across the table and held hands without saying a word. Somehow the restaurant felt warmer than it had only an hour earlier. Daniel turned back to Naomi. May I ask you one question? She nodded. Of course, sir. If you had known who my mother was before tonight, would you have done anything differently? Naomi smiled softly. No, sir. I hope I would have treated her exactly the same. Mrs. Kong laughed quietly, the gentle laugh of someone hearing the answer she already suspected. Good, she said, because that is exactly what you did. Daniel reached inside the inner pocket of his jacket and removed an elegant business card. It carried only his name, a phone number, and the discreet logo of Kong Global Holdings. He placed it on the table instead of handing it directly to Naomi. This is not payment, he said. Kindness should never become a transaction. Naomi looked at the card but made no move to pick it up. Daniel continued. If you ever decide your future belongs somewhere beyond this dining room, call that number. Not because you helped my mother, but because the kind of judgment you demonstrated tonight cannot be taught in a classroom. Naomi looked surprised. Sir, I do not know what to say. Mrs. Kong answered for him. You do not need to say anything tonight. She gently covered the business card with her hand before sliding it toward Naomi. Just promise me one thing. Anything, Naomi replied. Never allow the world to convince you that kindness is a weakness. Too many people confuse loud voices with strong hearts. Naomi carefully accepted the card with both hands. I promise. Daniel nodded once, satisfied not by her gratitude but by her sincerity. As he prepared to escort his mother home, several guests quietly stood from their tables. No one had asked them to. One by one, respectful applause spread across the Hawthorne room, not for wealth, influence, or business success, but for a young waitress who had refused to leave an elderly stranger standing alone. Naomi felt her face grow warm with embarrassment and looked toward the floor, while Mrs. Kong watched her with unmistakable pride. In that quiet applause, the restaurant honored something far more valuable than status. It honored the simple courage to choose compassion before knowing who might remember it. 1 year later, the Hawthorne room looked almost exactly the same. The chandeliers still reflected warm light across polished tables. The piano still filled the dining room with quiet melodies. Business leaders still gathered over expensive dinners, and visitors still arrived hoping to celebrate important moments. Yet something had quietly changed. Framed near the entrance was a simple statement adopted as part of the restaurant's service philosophy after that unforgettable evening. It read, "Respect every guest before you know their story." Most customers smiled as they walked past it. Very few realized those words had been inspired by a young waitress who once chose compassion over convenience. Naomi Carter no longer worked evening shifts at the restaurant. Several months after meeting Daniel and Mrs. Eun-hee Kong, she accepted an invitation to join the community outreach division of Kong Global Holdings. She had not been hired because she knew influential people. She had been hired because she had demonstrated the one quality no interview could reliably measure: character. Her new role allowed her to build scholarship programs, support neighborhood food initiatives, and help older adults who often struggled to find reliable transportation and daily assistance. Every decision reminded her of the promise she had made that evening. Kindness would never become something she practiced only when it was easy. Marcus had finished his first year of college with honors, proudly telling everyone his sister remained the strongest person he had ever known. Mrs. Kong often invited Naomi to afternoon tea, never as an employee or beneficiary, but as family. They spent hours discussing books, gardening, and the quiet strength found in ordinary people. Daniel occasionally joined them, usually listening more than speaking. Whenever business executives asked him how he identified trustworthy leaders, he rarely mentioned financial reports or impressive resumes. Instead, he shared a story about a waitress who believed dignity should never depend on wealth, appearance, or influence. He never revealed her name unless she gave permission. To him, the lesson mattered more than the recognition. Trevor Blake changed as well. Losing respect had forced him to confront something success had hidden for years. He began volunteering with organizations that supported senior citizens, not to repair his public image, but to rebuild his own understanding of humility. Change did not happen overnight, yet genuine change rarely does. Mrs. Kong accepted his handwritten apology several months later with the same grace she had shown from the beginning. She simply wrote back, "The future always listens more carefully than the past." Eric Sullivan transformed the culture inside the Hawthorne Room. Every new employee completed customer service training that emphasized empathy before efficiency. Managers were instructed that protecting a guest's dignity would never be considered poor judgment. Staff members noticed the difference immediately. Guests noticed it too. The restaurant earned a reputation not only for exceptional dining, but also for uncommon humanity. Looking back, people often assumed the evening became extraordinary because an influential family happened to be involved. They missed the real story. Everything important had already happened before anyone recognized Mrs. Kong. The defining moment arrived when Naomi believed she was standing beside an ordinary stranger with nothing to offer in return. That was the choice that revealed every heart inside the room. Wealth did not create the lesson. Power did not create the lesson. Identity did not create the lesson. One quiet decision did. Mrs. Kong had entered the restaurant dressed like any other elderly guest. Naomi had never asked who she was. She had only seen who she needed in that moment. Sometimes the greatest opportunities arrive disguised as ordinary encounters. Sometimes the people we overlook carry remarkable stories. And sometimes the strongest person in the room is not the one surrounded by influence, but the one willing to stand alone until kindness is no longer standing alone. She did not know she was protecting the mother of one of the most powerful families in the world. She only knew an older woman deserved respect. In the end, that simple truth became the only introduction that truly mattered. Power may open doors, but character decides who deserves to walk through them.